Imagine a state, more machine than nation, where a circle of corporations monitor your every move, where you're not a citizen, but an asset. No parliament, no president, no constitution, only the board, AI, and the directive. Welcome to the Corporate Federation, one of the greatest nations history has ever laid its regretful eyes on. At its height in 2224, it controlled more than half of the northern hemisphere, stretching from one side of the Bering Strait to the other way around. How did we let this happen? Well, I explained that in the Future Illustrated 3, but all my data got deleted, so I can't continue that series, so let me explain it in this. There was a national communist uprising in 2089 which triggered the Second Russian Civil War, followed by a corporate counter-uprising in 2092 where the corporate trinity assumed control over Russia. What followed was a radical transformation of Russian society, unlike anything that was ever seen before. Now, you know that thing that your teachers would do back in kindergarten where you would have a clip on the wall with colors, and if you were going green you were a good boy and if you were on red you fucked up? Well, now imagine that, but it controls your whole life. This system is called the score. It assigns citizens a score based on how they've been performing, their mental state, their loyalty to the Federation, and various other factors. It is tracked by neurocar implants, which everyone has to have in order to get work, go to school, whatever is important. The score determines everything: housing quality, food access, breeding rights, travel permits, and cyto access. What is cyto? Cytohexmethamphetamine, or cyto, is a highly addictive stimulant that creates productivity and clears the mind in certain doses. Discovered in 2079, it was widely produced and introduced on a wide scale across the corporate federation to control the population. Please the state and you get cyto. Displease the state and it gets revoked and you fall into withdrawal. And you don't want cyto withdrawals, let me tell you, they fucking suck. The score is divided into 5 levels: 1, 2, 3, 4, and even 5, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. These are essentially social classes, but you can move up by being loyal to the state. Level 1 is effectively the 1%, the richest, the toppest of dogs go to that level. Level 5 is pretty much prisoners. Fall to that level and you get sent to unoptimized centers, prison camps in Siberia. The rest of the world was horrified at this new state. The United States, a shell of its former self and taking a backseat in the free world to the EU, was thrown into panic. It was a strategic horror, a geopolitical nightmare unfolding right in front of them. One thing about 22nd century Russia is that it's powerful. The melting of permafrost combined with all the climate refugees flowing northward created an economic powerhouse. Combine that with the aggressive militarism of the corporate federation and you got a state that's ready to whoop some ass. And by 2107, that's exactly what was on the agenda. In what is known as the Dark Days, soldiers from the corporate federation crossed the border of the EU with their intent of conquest, while the Chinese Empire attacked Western allies in the east. Originally, the EU would hold firm against the corporate federation, however by 2110 their lines would break. Micro-drones flew across the battlefield, ripping people apart while hovers clouded the skies, and neural despair waves, also known as the Black Choir, blasted ultra-low neural disruption waves that induced apathy and suicidal thoughts. This was a war fought with not just the body but with the mind too, and the neural front of the war was intense. Lasers also played a major part, with corporate lasers sniping satellites out of the sky, accidentally surrounding Earth in an impenetrable layer of space junk that would heavily delay space travel. God fucking damn it. By 2112, Turkey had joined the war on the side of the corporate federation, opening a new front in the south. In 2117, Berlin would fall, followed by Paris in 2120. The next year, the corporate federation, actually can I just call them the corps? The corps would attempt something insane. The first ever invasion of continental America, landing on the warm shores of Alaska. By 2124, Greenland would be fully occupied by the corps. Britain would declare independence from the EU and align themselves with the corps, and by the next year in 2125, the war was over. The corps had won, and a new order was upon us. The board was now the most powerful entity in history, directing and reshaping the world in their image. New borders would be drawn across the Federation, dividing it into resource, residential, and research territories governed by overseers. By 2130, humanity would reach what is called the intellectual blockade, its peak intelligence. From here on out, average IQ would do nothing but drop, slowly, and technological progress would slow. AI is nothing but glorified chatbots that can assist the state, but sentience and singularity is not reached yet, as complex consciousness is something that's uniquely human. AI, however, is used to surveil the shit out of the population, using facial recognition technology to track your every movement, while implants track your mental state and adjust it accordingly. Mental illness is a thing of the past thanks to these implants. Your brain is no longer yours though, it belongs to the corpse. One of the more horrifying things that the corpse does is implement a maximum age, that being 70. After 70, you are deemed useless, and you either have to voluntarily or be forcibly sent to the releasement chambers, where you are given a quick and painless lethal injection. This is opposed by the majority of the population, of course, but who gives a shit what they think? Oh, the corps give a shit what they think, and that's why we have those brain implants. By 2140, the United States would undergo its national divorce caused by decades of bankruptcy, federal paralysis, and ideological and cultural fracturing. The United States would be divided into 8 countries, each at peace with one another in splendid isolation. Until, knock knock, it's the corporate federation. They would realize that complete and absolute control over the North Pole would be very beneficial. So they launched a full-scale invasion of Canada in 2143, going through the Arctic, Newfoundland, and Alaska, committing most heinous war crimes along the way to break the Canadian resolve, and by 2148, Canada was completely destroyed. The northern part of the country would be directly incorporated into the corporate federation as resource territories, while the south would become a satellite state of the federation, a buffer against the former United States. Examining the state of the world, there only seems to be 2 big dogs left, the corporate federation and the Chinese Empire. In 2158, a diplomatic incident in the Middle East led to Turania declaring war on the Persian Empire, which led to the Chinese coming to the Persians' aid, which led to the Corps coming to the Turanians' aid, starting the Asian War. Early on, the Chinese had the upper hand, but by 2160, the Turns had tabled and the Corps were pushing back against the Chinese. The Chinese, sensing imminent defeat, attempted to negotiate, but the Corps wanted nothing less than the destruction of the Chinese nation. The Corps shattered Chinese lines, committing horrific war crimes against its population while marching southward towards Beijing. Once the Corps arrived and began depopulating the city, China fired its nuclear arsenal towards the corporate federation, obliterating the cities of Irkutsk and Shana. The majority of Chinese megasonic missiles were disabled by corporate hackers though, and didn't detonate. In response to this, the Corps fired their arsenal at the Chinese, completely destroying the Yellow River Basin and all of its inhabitants. China then proceeded to fall into warlords again, and then collapsed because they do that a lot. The Corps then occupied Manchuria, Korea, Mongolia, and Xinjiang, and assimilated them into the Federation. It's at this point in 2163 that the Corps became the unquestionable world superpower. Every nation in the world would bend to the will of the board or risk suffering the same fate as China. It might seem like the corporate federation is invincible though, but that is simply not the case. There are loads of secret underground resistance networks operating via unknown glitches in the brain chips, allowing ordinary people to hack into them and control them. Where one glitch is patched, 2 more are discovered, and it essentially becomes a game of whack-a-mole for the Trinity. In 2166, one of the most influential pieces of anti-corporate literature is published, The Heart Remembers. Originally written in Britain and spread across the corporate federation, causing resistance to explode. Pamphlets rapidly circulated among the people, and over the course of the next year and a half, corporate drone towers were bombed, chips hubs were hijacked, and France was the center of it all. The leader of the anti-corporate movement was Elise Vauclin, a former neurocar scientist who defected after they killed her daughter. She was a skilled hacker who disabled her brain chip completely, entirely freeing her thoughts. She was also decytoned, which means she went through the cyto withdrawals and survived. She was joined by David Marius, a British man who helped author The Heart Remembers and would smuggle anti-corporate literature from across the channel. Together, they founded the Alliance for European Liberation, the most significant resistance movement against the Federation. They also had contacts in the French puppet government, which would be instrumental in orchestrating this rebellion. In 2168, after the biggest glitch was discovered in the brain chips, the French would begin open rebellion against the Corps with the goal of liberating Europe under the banner of the Alliance of European Liberation. Their goal was to establish a free, liberal, anti-corporate union similar to how the EU was run and completely expel these dirty corps from Western Europe. The next year, the rest of the corporate puppets in Western Europe would rise against the Federation, and the Federation would completely mobilize against this existential threat. Both sides employed biomech drones and autonomous robot soldiers, or Rs. Chip centers were destroyed across the Federation by terrorists as this rebellion ripped across Europe, and in 2171 the AEAL would reach its peak. Eventually, the Corps would launch Operation Cauterize and employ Nova Metas and obliterate cities across the AEL, killing Marius. The AEL would continue the fight until its last breath as the Corps blitzed across Germany and France, scorching the earth and slaughtering millions along the way, bathing the land in blood. Small cells would resist until 2176, until the rest would be destroyed. The Federation was changed forever. After this devastating conflict, the Federation became even more totalitarian. Brain chip glitches would be patched and the chips would be altered more intensely to monitor people. Even the slightest spike in stress would send drones your way. The implant location would change, being surgically attached to the upper brainstem, meaning that attempts to alter them would be fatal. The old score system would also be replaced with a new score system, a tiered classification system based not on just what people did, but what they felt as well. Scores of 1,000 plus would be considered pillars. They were granted reproductive permits, digital property ownership, and heavier cyto access, which was mandatory to take now, by the way. Scores of 600 and 999 were considered standard with baseline housing and rations. Scores under 600 were considered unaligned and they would be subject to correction, sent to unoptimized centers, or even released. Clinics, as they were called, became mandatory and every citizen must go to them every 3 days. It's essentially intensive therapy to both gather data and realign people's mental states. Also, by the way, the world's population has dropped to 5 billion and technological advancement has hit a plateau. What happens next is absolute corporate dominance over the world. Almost every nation is either allied or subservient to the Federation, and their dystopia can be felt across the planet. Tyrannia was essentially a puppet state, and so was the African Union. China was fractured, and so was the former United States. There were unaligned nations, though. Britain and Australia stayed firmly isolationist and anti-corporate. The UAF, the United American Confederacies, barely had any formal relations with the corps, and many Chinese states, including the Buchihua dynasty, which took control over Tibet, absolutely despised the corps. And India doesn't have any relations with the corps because they blew themselves up. In 2191, the corps would overthrow the government of Urbania in the US, establishing the corporate urban region and extending their rule into America. The rest of the US freaked out at this, establishing the Sovereign Union of America, a NATO-like alliance. The corps would go to war with them, but controlling half the planet is hard work and there are still large resistance movements, so not right now. In 2193, India would be split between the Federation and Tyrannia and they would clean up the land, plundering it for resources. In 2196, Canada and the CUR would be completely incorporated into the Federation, while the UAF would align with the Federation as they're having a governmental crisis due to climate change. Millions of refugees continue to flock northward into the Federation as sea level rise gobbles up coastlines and desertifies fertile land. As the 2200s began, the world is in a dystopian state. The corps control most of the northern hemisphere, penetrating into people's minds, while surveillance drones capture every living moment within the Federation's bounds. Of course, there are resistance networks, but they aren't as powerful as they used to be. In 2208, Britain would be invaded by the Federation and it would fall within a few months. Italia would also be incorporated, and the Federation is essentially at its peak. However, it would slowly become more and more outdated. Resistance networks would grow while the Trinity would oftentimes paralyze itself in disagreement. They then took the oversimplified route of starting wars to distract everyone from their misery. In 2224, corporate forces would cross the border into Buchihua territory, cutting through its population with drones. The next year, they would take part in the Continental War in America, defending their allies, the UAF in the Andes against Shasta, Dixie, New Portugal, and La Plata. They also invaded Allegheny. By 2226, the Buchihua War had turned into a guerrilla conflict as the corps were really only able to hold the roads in the major cities while the Buchihua population did repeated hit-and-run attacks. The world is essentially in a state of war. Not one big war, but multiple smaller wars all erupting at once. By 2230 though, the tables are turning. Corporate forces are being massacred by Buchihua resistance, while Dixie and Allegheny push back against the corps after a peace deal is negotiated with the UAF. It's clear that the corporate federation would not be winning this war, and their control over the world order would be shattered. In what was once Urbania, the new Sons of Liberty would rise up against corporate control, taking control of Urbania and establishing the Republic of Fredonia, which would later become the United Sovereignty, a revival of the United States based on analog governance and conservative anti-corporate values. By 2238, the corporate federation was in absolute crisis. Resistance networks were reaching a critical mass while the Buchihua crossed into the Federation. What the fuck is happening? Even Tyrannia is going through it, as Egypt just became independent. 2243 would be one of the worst years for the Federation. The large Chinese population in the east would rise up under the banner of the Shangli Revolutionary Army, while the Buchihuas occupied large amounts of territory over the Federation. India would also break free, and it's clear that their complete control over the international order is over. The Federation is an outdated state, a relic from a time long ago. In 2246, the Shangli Revolution would succeed, and the Amur Confederation gained independence from the corps, losing them a valuable territory. In 2248, in the Treaty of Tihua, the Buchihuas would be given Xinjiang as exchange for peace, as the corporate federation was on the verge of civil war from internal strife. Anti-Trinity factions within the Federation were growing, and it's just a matter of time before shit would get nasty. In 2256, there would be a brief large-scale rebellion in Iberia that would be put down, but they would sabotage the biggest brain chip center in the Federation, rendering the chips and the majority of the population unusable. This would directly culminate in the corporate civil war beginning in 2262. Crescendo, a faction within the board that wishes to restore the Federation to its former glory and conquer the entire planet, rises up against the Trinity in much of its territories and quickly starts winning against them. The people of the Federation were ready for a fresh face, but can Crescendo provide for them? They would win the war in 2265, defeating the Trinity, and they would begin radically changing the Federation. The chips would be fixed and brought back online, and a third score system would be developed. They would also ramp up military spending heavily as preparation for their plan of world domination. The United Sovereignty senses something is wrong and launches a preemptive attack on corporate Canada. In 2267, in a shocking turn of events, the Crescendo-controlled Corporate Federation proclaims the global corporate state and begins their invasion across the world. Kinetic rods are employed, destroying city after city, while the UAF joins the fray, attacking the United Sovereignty from the south. The Azanians would lose the Arabian Peninsula to the Corps, while Ariana and Buchihua suffer heavy losses. Every corporate asset is directed towards this conflict, and it begins to take an extremely heavy toll on the Corps. By 2270, the Corps have conquered Egypt from the Azanians, and most of Amuria's population centers too, and they began an invasion of Morocco, which would fall next year. In 2272, Antarctica would join the Corps as their government had pretty much been integrated into them for about a decade, the last major expansion of corporate control. This year also saw the Corps making peace with Azania, with them giving up Egypt. The next year, a group called the Visionaires, a clique within Crescendo, would attempt a coup against the Crescendo government. It would fail, but Visionaire units still controlled parts of Western Europe, beginning the Visionaire Uprising. The next year, the Visionaires would control most of Western Europe and had the global corporate state absolutely panicking. The nations of the world saw this and began ripping the dying state to shreds. Canada would fall to the United Sovereignty, the Buchihuas, Amuria, and Ariana would push into corporate territory, and the Azanians would even betray the Corps. The last year of this wretched state would be 2278, with the Visionaires establishing the corporate republic across Europe and the Middle East. What would remain in Siberia is a patchwork of competing states, factions, and corporations that would be fighting for control. The Corps left a horrific legacy behind, one of terror, dystopia, and oppression. However, they also modernized the entire northern hemisphere and presided over the peak of several centuries of technological progress and growth. This, however, wouldn't be the end of Crescendo and the Federation. Multiple warlords claimed to be the true successors of it, but Crescendo had something the rest of them didn't: Antarctica.